So last episode we talked a lot about summer vacation and how critics of summer vacation base their criticism or their opposition really on just one factor, and that factor is a post-summer break dip in standardized test scores, which they call summer learning loss. The research brought up to support this concern, mainly Harris Cooper's meta-analysis from 1996, that seems to be one of the main ones. It uses standardized test scores as a proxy for student learning writ large. A cornerstone of my educational philosophy has been that standardized tests are an incomplete and imperfect proxy for a child's education, talking about the whole education. And if you base your practices and your policies on imperfect proxies, you end up with a system engineered to employ imperfect practices, and it gets imperfect outcomes. By basing our entire educational approach in the United States on how our practices impact bubble test performance, we're ensuring an overemphasis on certain discrete skills and knowledge that are good for being measured by that standardized test, but we're also at the same time completely failing to measure a whole galaxy of equally important, if not more important, stuff that gets ignored, not because it's not important, not because it doesn't dictate how kids' lives go in the future, but simply because it isn't convenient to reduce to test items that can be mass scored by machines. It's the equivalent of getting ready in the morning by looking at a funhouse mirror and hoping that your hair and makeup look good. Standardized test scores can't accurately and appropriately represent student learning writ large. They capture this minuscule sliver from which our educational policy makers have satisfied themselves with a sleight of hand that I call the great extrapolation. They know that they can't capture everything, so they satisfy themselves with capturing this sliver. Extrapolation is when you take a single data point and you stretch it to draw conclusions that really you need additional different data points to establish. It's like if you get a glimpse of 1/10 of a robbery suspect's face, and after describing it, you ask an artist to just fill in the rest based on that 10th that you saw, and use that to draw the wanted poster, hoping that the final outcome hopefully resembles the actual culprit. It's like adding water to soup in order to feed a bigger crowd than the chef was expecting. So the best the accountability cult can do is create complex formulas that slice and dice this single inadequate ingredient, these scores, in a bunch of different ways to give the illusion of variety, to produce multiple numbers that we pretend mean different things, but they really are just that same standardized test score chopped up in different ways. They don't really tell us different things about the quality of education in our schools. I'm going to use our state as an example. In Texas, we use the STAR test. And in elementary schools in Texas, the STAR test is the only factor that determines the A through F rating. Now, it's looked at through different lenses, but it's always the STAR test at the foundation of all these formulas. After decades of complaints from teachers that the accountability system shouldn't base everything on a single day high stakes test, the legislature passed laws requiring more nuance in the system, and that's when the STAR test came into being and replaced the previous test. Now, at the secondary level, when this law happened, it meant including other things in the accountability formulas. So at the secondary level, you have career and tech ed outcomes, like, for example, how many industry-based certifications do students earn in your high school? And they also added in graduation rates. So at the secondary level, it isn't just the STAR test. And you can see across Texas, secondary schools tend to do better on the accountability system than elementary schools because it's not so one-dimensional. But at the elementary level, the machine that spits out A through F grades, at the elementary level, there are neither graduation rates nor career and tech ed programs. Elementaries don't have those things. So what are we left with? You guessed it, one thing, the student scores on the standardized test. We have various domains, right? So we have domain 1, it's called student achievement. Student achievement measures whether students met expectations on the STAR test. That's domain 1. Well, we have domain 2. All right, some variety. Maybe we're not looking at STAR. Wrong, we are. It's called school progress. School progress shows how students perform on STAR over time and how the school's performance on STAR compares to other schools' performance on STAR. Let's move on to domain 3, closing the gaps. Closing the gaps is complicated. It looks at 4 different things. The first one is called academic achievement. Academic achievement on domain 3 looks at student STAR performance at the meets level, which is a higher level than the basic level that's looked at in the other domain. If it were a casserole, we'd be throwing in some star-shaped macaroni to go with our elbow macaroni, but it's still just macaroni. Also under domain 3, you have growth. Growth status measures the percentage of students who gain a year academically in reading and math on STAR. Also in domain 3, we have something called student success. This one looks at how students perform on STAR compared to students of other races. Every single A through F rating assigned to every single public elementary school in Texas is tied to one thing and one thing only: student performance on a single day high stakes bubble test that is graded at least partially with AI. We've built the entire accountability system on this single cornerstone. People in favor of this approach will tell you an imperfect measure is better than no measure at all. If we talk about standardized test scores, we can pretend we're talking about education, but we're not talking about education, not really. It's a diversion, it's an oversimplification of the complex reality of educating children. There's a reason that private schools and homeschoolers don't take STAR in Texas, even though the law allows them to. It's because they don't want to. It's not because they don't want to know how their kids are doing academically. It's because they don't value this reductive, mostly blind tool. It doesn't tell them enough information that they need to make educational decisions, so they disregard it. They don't care how their students look in the funhouse mirror of this silly test. Now, you may have heard some good news lately from Texas that our governor is saying he's getting rid of STAR. And boy, that is great politics to say that, right? Unfortunately, it just isn't true. They're not getting rid of STAR. They are repackaging STAR under a new name. The new name is SST. I'm pretty sure that stands for Superstar. It's the same single day, high stakes test approach, boiling down all of a year's education of a child across all the subjects and all the experiences down to a 40 or 50 question test. A test with questions that have distractors built in and trickery built in, because that's the only way they can mimic the actual rigor that goes into teacher-made assessments that involve things like writing and explaining, showing your work. A machine can't grade those things, and so they have to replace real rigor with pretend rigor of these distractors and these trick questions. The proxy just isn't good enough for substantial policy making. It's not good enough for substantial decision making, like which schools to close down, which schools for the state to take over. It has never been sufficient for that. It might serve as a single small indicator in a larger environment of data that helps us decide which schools are doing well and which ones aren't, but it can't be the whole enchilada. We have elevated the standardized test performance to be the center of the American education universe. It's a huge mistake. It's meant to emulate something much bigger and more sacred than it is. It's like an idol. It's like a golden calf. What it is meant to emulate or represent is the development of children's minds and hearts and all the education that goes on in a school year. It takes our eyes off of what really matters, the child's full development. And that's something nebulous that you just can't reduce to something as bounded and concrete as a 2-hour test without losing much of its true character. This thing, the standardized test score, doesn't really resemble the education of that child. And the bubble test can't fully show us what that child learned and how that teacher did, but we let it do those very things. It's too imprecise. It's too easy to misinterpret. It's too easy to misrepresent. It's too easy to manipulate and twist into politicized narratives, which is exactly what happens. We've tolerated sloppy lawmaking built on this one sloppy assertion that standardized test performance equals student learning and can tell us all about how good or bad the school is. We've tolerated this inaccuracy for far too long. This false notion is at the heart of the very worst media coverage about schools, the worst laws made related to schools, the worst regulations we've seen. All the things that are at the root of today's teacher shortage can be traced back to the misuse of standardized test scores. I complain about standardized test scores used improperly because that is the original sin of the school reform movement. It's the central load-bearing post upon which all of it hangs. Today's critical teacher shortage, it starts with standardized test scores driving education policy and casting teachers as villains. It also makes people not want to work in the schools that need the best teachers, because those are the schools that have the biggest challenges. Myopic and biased researchers feeding these silly systems to our politicians and the bogus conclusions that the media receives at the end of every testing season. These things are slowly killing the American education system. If an international enemy had imposed on our nation a corrosive education reform movement, an agenda built exclusively on the foundation of these out-of-focus standardized test results, we would likely consider it an act of war. Standardized tests measure some stuff. They measure a very specific, very limited, very curated, very tiny set of knowledge and skills. Looking for the impact of things like summers off in the tea leaves of a 50-question multiple choice test is like trying to tell your future by studying the lines on your palm. It's not science. It just isn't. It's voodoo. It's better than nothing, they'll argue. It's a sampling, right? But I think this approach is actually worse than nothing, because we attribute way too much representative accuracy to the results of these crude instruments. The lines on your hand, they can probably tell you something about your life, like which hand you write with maybe, but extrapolating from there and deciding those lines can tell you something about your destiny is something we all know is hogwash. Modern researchers at education agencies are doing the same thing with these standardized tests. They're just these mad extrapolators. Standardized tests cannot bear the weight we have placed upon them. They are the fragile cornerstones of the entire American education system, but they're not strong enough. Look again at my state. We have this incredibly complex, over-engineered system that allows government officials using nothing but STAR test scores to award multi-million-dollar grants to certain school districts and to force wholesale change, to get rid of school boards, to get rid of superintendents, to permit school closures and takeovers by the state. And it's all based on one test, one single day, high stakes test. And it's all overseen by this huge and growing bureaucracy, right? The number of employees at the Texas Education Agency has grown and grown and grown because they've built this monstrosity of an ecosystem all around the STAR test and nothing else, because nothing else matters. It all serves one goal: raise scores on this one test, STAR, the heart of the Texas education system, soon to be rebranded as SST because nobody likes STAR, because everybody knows this is wrong, right? Under any name and in any state, not just Texas, using standardized test scores this way is like using a chisel for brain surgery. Standardized tests give clumsy information on the basis of which a whole army of too smart by half technocrats builds overcomplicated Rube Goldberg machines supposedly to improve learning, but in reality, not. Just to improve instead how children move through their maze, their standardized maze, that they assure us is the equivalent of real learning in real life. As if to make my point, most research on summer vacation is really uncurious about summer learning gains that are too holistic to be measured by a bubble test. Test scores are just too convenient as a source of data. So why put in the effort to investigate anything else, something that the tests can't capture? We choose to be blind to everything that can't be shoehorned into a standardized test. And that's the danger of this approach. All that stuff matters. You can't take an accurate picture of a student or a school with a one-day high-stakes test. You just can't. And so we need to stop. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll tune in next time to Let's Be Honest with John Q.